Hello, my friends. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to listen to chapters 1, 2, and 3 from The Secret Garden. Classic starts. Chapter 1. No One Left. When Mary Lennox was born, no one really wanted her. Her father worked for the British government in India and had no time for raising a child. Mary's beautiful mother hadn't wanted a little girl at all. She cared only about going to parties. So their sickly, fretful baby was handed over to an ayah, an Indian nanny. Mary's ayah knew that the baby's crying made her mother angry, so to keep Mary quiet, she let her have her own way in everything. Mary grew up as selfish a child as had ever lived. Her thin face looked yellow, and her expression was sour as a lemon. Even her blonde hair wouldn't behave. Governesses were hired to teach the cross child to read and write, but they never lasted longer than a few months. Except for her ayah and the servants, Mary hardly ever saw other people, not even her mother. One blazing hot morning when Mary was 9, she was awakened by an unknown servant. She wanted her ayah, but her ayah couldn't come. Even when Mary had a tantrum, the servant just looked frightened and repeated her message. Mary knew something strange was happening, but no one could tell her what. Left alone, she went outside to play under a tree near the veranda. She was making a pretend flower bed when she heard her mother's voice speaking with a young army officer. They didn't notice the little girl, but Mary saw that her mother was alarmed. "Is it so very bad?" her mother asked. "Awfully," the officer replied. "You should have left 2 weeks ago, Mrs. Lennox, instead of staying for the ball." Just then Mary heard a shout from the servants' quarters that grew louder and wilder. "Someone has died," the officer said, his voice shaking. Mary's mother gasped and ran inside. Later, Mary found out that a dread disease, cholera, had broken out. Her ayah had been the first to die, and many others were in danger. In a panic, many of the servants ran away in terror, leaving no one to care for Mary. For 2 whole days, Mary hid in the nursery. Off and on she cried and slept. She could hear odd, frightening sounds in the house and from the servants' huts. In the confusion, everyone had forgotten about her. The next day, Mary wandered into the dining room and ate some biscuits and fruit. She also drank a glass of tonic someone had left on the table. It was like medicine, and it made her drowsy. She went back to her bedroom and fell into a deep sleep. Mary finally awoke to the silence and lay in her bed and listened for noises, but the house was perfectly still. Then she heard a rustling on the floor mat. Looking down, she saw a little snake. She wasn't afraid of him, knowing he was harmless. She watched him glide across the floor and slip under her door. Were they alone in the house? She wondered. Then she heard heavy footsteps on the veranda and men talking in low voices. One man said, "What a shame. That beautiful woman dead. I heard there was a child too, but no one ever saw her." Just then Mary's door opened. Mary stood up and an army officer came in looking weary and troubled. Stiffly, the child said in a cross voice, "I am Mary Lennox. I fell asleep when everyone had cholera, and I just woke up." Stamping her foot, she demanded, "Why have they forgotten me? Why does nobody come?" A younger soldier with the officer just shook his head sadly and held Mary's hand. "Poor little kid. There's nobody left to come." This was the strange, sudden way Mary found out that both her parents and most of the servants had died. There really was no one left but herself and the rustling little snake. Chapter 2. The Moors. The soldiers took Mary to the home of the Reverend Crawford, a poor English minister. He told her that she would soon be sailing to London and would live with her guardian, Mr. Archibald Craven, at Misselthwaite Manor in Yorkshire. So Mary left India and sailed on a long ocean voyage to England. In London, she was handed over to Mr. Craven's housekeeper, Mrs. Medlock, a stout woman with sharp black eyes and a black cape. Mary didn't like her, but then again, she hardly liked anyone. The next day, they began their railway journey to Misselthwaite Manor. Mary sat with her hands folded in her lap and stared out the window. She pretended not to care as Mrs. Medlock told her about her new home. "It's a grand place in a gloomy way," said the housekeeper. 600 years old, with nearly 100 rooms full of fine paintings and furniture. But most of them are locked up. The man is on the edge of the moor. It has a big park with gardens and trees. Do you know anything about your uncle?" "No," Mary said, acting bored. "But don't you care? Didn't your parents ever tell you?" Mrs. Medlock asked. "Why should it matter?" Mary replied. "Well, I suppose it doesn't," Mrs. Medlock said. "He is not going to give a bother about you. He never troubles himself about anyone." Hmm. She trailed off. A few moments later she continued. "Mr. Craven's got a crooked back. He was never happy till he married. His wife, your aunt, was a sweet, pretty thing, and he'd have walked the world over to get her a blade of grass if she'd asked. Some people said she married him for his money, but she didn't. When she died, he became stranger than ever. Won't see people. Most times he's away. When he's at home, he shuts himself up in the West Wing. Don't expect to see him," Mrs. Medlock warned, "and don't expect people to talk to you. You'll look after yourself. You'll be told which rooms you can go into. You can play in the garden, but don't go poking about the house. Mr. Craven won't have it." "I won't," Mary said tartly. She turned again to look out the window. Her eyelids grew heavy, looking at the gray, rainy drizzle, and she fell asleep. A few hours later, Mrs. Medlock shook Mary. "Wake up!" she said. "We're at Thwaite Station. Now we have a long drive across Missel Moor." Mary stood and tried to keep her eyes open. She followed Mrs. Medlock from the train onto the railway platform. A large carriage awaited them. A footman in a long raincoat helped Mary and Mrs. Medlock inside. Then he climbed up his seat beside the carriage driver, and off they were. In the light of the carriage's lamps, Mary caught glimpses of the tiny village of Thwaite, whitewashed houses, a church, and a few shops. After that, she saw only trees and hedges beside the road. Then there was nothing but blackness out the carriage windows on both sides. Suddenly, she felt a sharp jolt. "We're on the moor now!" Mrs. Medlock exclaimed. The yellow light of the carriage lamps revealed some bushes and low-growing things along the road. In the darkness, the wind made an eerie, low, rushing sound. "Is that the sea?" Mary asked. "No, not the sea, or the fields, or the mountains," answered Mrs. Medlock. "The moor is just miles and miles of wasteland, and no one lives on it except the wild ponies and sheep." Mrs. Medlock paused. I think it's a dreary place, but some people like it in the springtime. The carriage rattled over bridges and bumps. Mary could hear water rushing very fast under them. She felt like they were driving over a windy black ocean. I don't like the moor, she thought. I don't like it at all. At last the carriage stopped in a clearing in front of a very long house built around a courtyard. A single light glowed from the upstairs window. Mary followed Mrs. Medlock to a huge oak door that opened onto an enormous hall with a stone floor. In the dim light, Mary could make out portraits on the walls and figures in suits of armor. She felt very small and lost in the shadowy hall. A thin old butler was there to meet them, but he didn't speak to Mary. The man said to Mrs. Medlock, "Mr. Craven doesn't want to see her. He's gone to London in the morning and doesn't want to be disturbed." "Very well," Mrs. Medlock replied. "I can manage." The housekeeper led Mary up a wide staircase and down a dim hallway. Finally, they reached Mary's rooms. A coal fire burned on the hearth, and a table was set with supper. "You can eat now, then I'll help you get to bed," Mrs. Medlock said. "You'll have this room and the nursery next door, so don't go wandering about the house. Understand?" Mary understood, but she had perhaps never felt so miserable in her life. Chapter 3. A Maid Named Martha. Mary awoke to the sounds of a young housemaid kneeling at the fireplace, sweeping cold cinders into the pan. Mary watched her for a few moments, then she glanced around the room. Even in the daylight, it seemed oddly gloomy. The walls were covered with a tapestry embroidered with pictures of a forest and people in strange clothing. Mary turned to the window. She saw a great stretch of flat, treeless land. It resembled a dull purple sea. "What's that?" she asked, pointing toward the window. The young maid said, "That's the moor. Do you like it?" "No," Mary said. "I hate it." The maid grinned and said, "You'll get used to it. It looks a bit bare in the winter, but in the summer it's covered with the wild heather, and it smells as sweet as honey. The air's so fresh and the sky looks so high, full of bees and skylarks. I wouldn't live away from the moor for anything." Mary was puzzled. In India, the servants never talked freely. Curious, Mary said, "You're a strange servant. What's your name?" The maid laughed. "I'm Martha, and I know I seem a little strange to you. I'm a country girl from Yorkshire. If Misselthwaite were like any other big houses, I'd have to work in the kitchen. But this house has no mistress, and Mr. Craven's nearly always away, so I work upstairs." "Are you my servant?" Mary asked. "I'm Mrs. Medlock's servant," Martha replied, "but I'll clean your room and wait on you a bit." Mary had to listen as Martha, whose friendly voice had a soothing effect, told her all about her large family and their cottage on the moor. "My brother Dickon is 12, and he's got a young pony. He found it and its mother on the moor. He'd give it bits of bread and grass, and it got to like him. Now it follows him around and even lets him ride it. Dickon's a kind lad, and animals like him." Mary began to take a slight interest in Dickon. This was strange because Mary had never been interested in anyone but herself. Mary had some tea and a little toast. Then Martha cleared the table. "You wrap up warm now and go outside to play," she said. "That will give you an appetite, it will." Mary looked out the window. "Why should I go out on a day like this?" she asked. Everything looked gray and wintry. Martha answered, "If you don't go out, you'll have to stay in. And what will you do here?" Martha was right. There were no toys or books in the nursery or in the bedroom. "Who will go with me?" Mary asked. "You'll go by yourself, of course," Martha said. "Our Dickon plays on the moor alone for hours. He plays with the pony and the sheep that know him. The birds come to eat out of his hand. It's very grand." Mary thought that at least there would be birds to amuse her. Martha helped her into her coat, cap, and sturdy boots, and led her downstairs. At the door, Martha pointed to a gate in the bushes. "The gardens are through there. You can play in all of 'em except the one that's locked up. Mr. Craven shut it when his wife died 10 years ago and buried the key." A bell rang and Martha hurried away. Alone, Mary stepped outside, left to wonder about the locked garden. Okay, my friends, that was chapters 1, 2, and 3 of The Secret Garden Classic Starts. Make sure you come back for the rest of the story. Bye bye now.